Today's scripture reading is from the book of Isaiah in the Old Testament, chapter 9, verses 1 through 7. But there will be no gloom for her who was in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali. But in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. The people who walked in darkness have seen a great light. Those who dwelt in a land of deep darkness, on them has light shone. You have multiplied the nation. You have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil. For the yoke of his burden and the staff for his shoulder, the rod of his oppressor, you have broken as on the day of Midian. For every boot of the trampling warrior in battle tumult and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder, and his name shall be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and of peace there will be no end, on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish it and to uphold it with justice and with righteousness from this time forth and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will do this. This is God's word.
Uh-oh. It's a good start. I'll aim it this way. I've been playing a game to see who I think are Texans based on shivering level this morning, because this is not that cold, people from Texas. But I can't see all the layers, so some of you might be looking brave, but wearing 12 layers, I don't know. I wonder what you think of when you think of light. What image or experience comes to mind? For me, it's not necessarily the brightest thing I've ever seen. In fact, kind of far from it. For me, it's probably the biggest contrast of light I've ever seen. My wife, Natalie, and I got to visit the Isle of Skye off the northwest coast of Scotland in the Highlands. And it is a lush green, almost like otherworldly atmosphere. It's very gray, very overcast often. But these shafts of light will kind of come through and light up the cliff sides, the waterfalls. It's an incredible experience. And I think what makes it so memorable is, again, not that it's so bright, but that the contrast is so stark, that you see light and darkness side by side. You almost get the feeling, if any of you have been there or to the Scottish Highlands, that if the light was out, if the sun was out in full bloom, it might blind you because everything is so colorful and the gray kind of cuts through that. And I think, again, one of the reasons that contrast is so powerful is because it shows us that light and darkness only make sense in the context of each other. Francis Bacon, the English writer, once wrote, "In order for the light to shine so brightly, the darkness must be present." Without the context of darkness, what would be light? And without the context of light, what would be darkness? To put it in maybe 2020 terms, without the context of wearing a mask and walking around sort of cautiously, not knowing how to breathe or if you can breathe, how can we appreciate what an unburdened, healthy breath of air feels like? The contrast can be so powerful. Today, I want to talk about this relationship between light and darkness, and it's appropriate to do so because we're beginning a new series that we're calling Light of the World. It's a series for Advent, a series for this time of year, a different kind of Advent, but nevertheless a season that is focused on the greatest light, the light of the world, Christ himself. Some of you have maybe had experiences with Christianity or with Christians where it's all light all the time. It's buoyant and optimistic and Pollyanna and always great. And I think that does a disservice to the power of light when we erase the darkness that it grows out of. And so if what you heard from Isaiah 9 this morning sounded like all upbeat prophecy of coming deliverance, well, brace yourself because we're going to talk about why it comes on the heels of actually tragedy. And so I think when we ignore the darkness in our life, when we pretend like it's not happening, we not only do a disservice philosophically to the relationship between light and dark, but we also do a disservice to the power of light when it does come. to the power of light when it does arrive. And so I want to talk about three things in this passage this morning. My points: the crack in everything, the light in everything, and Christ our everything. First, the crack in everything. If you look at today's passage, Isaiah 9, verse 1, you will see a word probably translated in most of your Bibles as but, or nevertheless, or yet. This little word is a Hebrew word, ki, K-I, and it's actually a really complicated, it's two letters, but it's a really complicated word. It can mean that, for, when, or because. It's a connector, it's a conjunction. But when we add the word not next to it in Hebrew, it becomes the word but. And maybe you've heard preachers, when they're talking about the New Testament, they talk about therefore, and they say, what is the therefore? Well, in Old Testament terms, when you see a passage or a chapter that begins with the word but, you should always go back and ask, what's the but therefore? What are we sort of coming on the heels of? What's the answer that this is answering? So we have to go back to Isaiah 8 briefly. Isaiah 8, 21 to 22. They will pass through the land greatly distressed and hungry. And when they are hungry, they will be enraged and will speak contemptuously against their king and their God, and turn their faces upward. And they will look to the earth, but behold distress and darkness, the gloom of anguish, and they will be thrust into thick darkness. Merry Christmas. When you read this passage, you might be thinking that Isaiah is talking about the wilderness journey of the Israelites when they escaped Egypt and wandered to Canaan, but he's not. It's actually a prophecy of forthcoming events. It's about the advent of the Assyrian invasion, which will place Israel under the yoke of Assyria, what historians call the yoke of Assyria, because it's so burdensome, so painful for the Israelites. Archaeologists will say they actually turn Israel into what's called a client kingdom. It's kind of a euphemism. They're not really clients. It's basically another era of enslavement for the Israelites that's forthcoming. So when we get to Isaiah 9, if we ignore Isaiah 8, if we ignore the darkness that's also being prophesied, again, we do a disservice to the power of this deliverance. And you can imagine the Israelites must be feeling a little bit mixed emotions, because both prophecies are coming at the same time. Isaiah is saying to the people through God that there is a yoke of Assyria. The Assyrians are coming. Something terrible is about to happen. But if you keep your eyes on what will come after, this great light, then it will make everything look differently. So that word key, K-I, Isaiah 9:1, that word key is the key, I think, to understanding this passage. If we ignore the K-I, if we ignore the but, and we ignore what comes before it, then we do, again, a disservice. I am a basketball fan, sometimes, depends. But I sometimes get frustrated when I watch the NBA because it's all about taking shots. It's all about, Golden State Warriors 3-point shots. What I actually like watching, maybe I'm alone in this, is second chance points, rebounds. I like watching teams that play like teams. And what I want to say is that if we really dig into what this Hebrew word key is about, I think metaphorically we could call it a rebound. It's grace, it's the rebound of grace. Isaiah 9:1, let's just read it in full. But there will be no gloom for her who is in anguish. In the former time he brought into contempt the land of Zebulun and the land of Naphtali, but in the latter time he has made glorious the way of the sea, the land beyond the Jordan, Galilee of the nations. Despite the terrible news of the yoke of Assyria, this latter time is coming where the kingdom will be centered not in Jerusalem, but in Galilee. It's an interesting prophecy about the place where Christ will speak to thousands. And so if you put Isaiah 8 and 9 together in context, what you're doing is you're putting the prophecy of darkness and the prophecy of light together. And what it acknowledges is it acknowledges pain and anguish and heartbreak. It doesn't paste over those things. And I think probably no one puts it better than Leonard Cohen in his song, Anthem, when he says, "Ring the bells that can still ring, forget your perfect offering. There is a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in." It is by way of our heartbreak that the greatest light and the greatest deliverance will come to us. That's why we must acknowledge the darkness, because if we don't acknowledge the brokenness in ourselves and in our world, then we won't know how to let the light in or where the light will come from. But if you follow Cohen's words, if you follow the logic of it, he says, there's a crack in everything. That's how the light gets in. Well, next I want to talk about the light in everything, because if there's a crack in everything, and if that's how the light gets in, then there's also the potential for light in everything. There's always the possibility and potential for hope and for deliverance. That's what Isaiah 9 is all about. A brief aside, I think. It's important to acknowledge that the idea of light is actually, at least in the 20th century, not always a universally well-received concept. Actually, many artists in the 20th century, if you guys are into art or literature, rejected the concept of light and line. They thought there's an overabundant emphasis on light in the artistic world. The poet Wallace Stevens wrote a poem about Pablo Picasso and on Cubism, and he writes these words: "Throw away the light and the definitions, and say of what you see in the dark." Stevens' rejection of the idea of light is not an embrace of darkness. He's actually challenging us to face the ambiguities of our life, to face those gray areas, to face areas where there is moral uncertainty. That is where we will find the greatest deliverance if we are brave enough to face those things that don't have easy answers. Is this not a year that is sort of short on easy answers? And I will say, as I said earlier, maybe you've experienced a form of Christianity that is so single-mindedly focused on light and on deliverance that it feels unrealistic. Perhaps you have in your life people who are fixers. What they want more than anything is for you to be happy and for you to be okay. But in their attempt to sort of fix things for you, they oddly can't be there for you. You may have friends that would walk through fire for you, but you feel like you're drowning. And so that wouldn't really be helpful at that point. I was talking to a friend a couple of weeks ago, and he said that his parents were like this, that his parents always wanted to make everything okay. And sometimes they just wanted a space where things could not be okay. But the sort of irony of life is that as we get older, sometimes, maybe you've had this experience, you want that for your parents. As you get older, you start wanting to fix things for your parents as they get older, as they age. You want everything to be okay, and you don't know how to sit with the uncertainty, to sit with the darkness and gloom of a present circumstance or situation. Again, we can't ignore that. We have to sit with that. But we also have to keep our eyes focused on the hope, the potential for light in everything. And when we see light like this, I think beauty always follows. If you look at Isaiah 9 just on the page, you'll see that on Isaiah 9, verse 2 through 7, suddenly poetry erupts in the midst of the prophecy. This is a signal on the page that something is changing in the way these words are being spoken and delivered. And it's actually a poem. I mean, it is a kind of poetics. And there are three kind of things that I want to show you about this little poem in Isaiah 9. First, the assurance of joy. Second, the end of war. And third, the new kingdom. If you look at Isaiah 9:3, you'll see these words: "You have multiplied the nation, you have increased its joy. They rejoice before you as with joy at the harvest, as they are glad when they divide the spoil." I count at least 4 joyful descriptions in this passage. There is a lot of joy happening. But this poem sets itself up in what we would call a deductive fashion, because it actually tells us they're happy. It doesn't tell us why they're joyful. And so we have to keep reading to deduce or to find the source of this joy, and we'll find it in the next verse. The you of this passage is foretelling the coming of Christ, who will end war forever. That's the second point of this poem, is that it's about the end of warfare. It's about the end of heartbreak. It's an ending and an erasure of violence in all forms. But ultimately, the reason the wars can end is because an altogether new kind of kingdom is arriving. And that's what we see at the end of this passage, Isaiah 9, 6 through 7. "For to us a child is born, to us a son is given, and the government shall be upon his shoulder." This child, this king, comes to be a different kind of king, to wage a different kind of war. In fact, I would say wage an anti-war, a war whose outcome is ultimately the erasure of hurt and violence and trauma in all forms. And so when we look at Isaiah 9 and we read about the coming of this light, we have to remember that there is a crack in everything, but it's through that crack that the deliverance of the Son of God will come in our hurt, in our brokenness. And that is why finally Christ is our everything. Final point, Christ, our everything. To let this light in, we don't have to paste over the broken parts of us. We don't have to pretend like there isn't sin and grief and death and sadness. In fact, if we were to do that, again, how would the light get in? It would just be further darkening. If you think that Christianity is a legalistic code of ethics by which you perfect yourself constantly to make yourself approved before a God and King, it is the opposite of that. The cracks in you is what Christ came to shed light in, through, and into your very soul. I've had the good fortune of breaking my arms and wrists like 8 or 9 times, actually. My family lost track. Probably a little ashamed that I'm saying this, but how silly it would have been when I broke an arm to just swallow the pain, pretend like it wasn't happening. No, what you do when you break an arm is you go get an x-ray and you go get a cast. You place the broken parts under the radiation, under the light, if you will, to see where the break is, to find out how to mend it. And doctors will tell you, as the David Wilcox song goes, if you know it, that you will be stronger in the broken places. The bones heal back stronger than before, although I guess my personal history is not good evidence of that because I broke the same arm like over and over and over again. But like x-rays and radiation of all kinds, the goodness of God, the light of Christ is like this. It's kind of an intense matter. It's something that we should strive for, something that brings great hope. But it can also be, in its own way, a kind of difficult exposure of the self. You have to be willing to be vulnerable. You have to be willing to look your shortcomings, your miscalculations, your misjudgments in the face. You have to bring them before Christ. Ask Paul, formerly Saul of Tarsus, about the brightness of Christ when he saw him on the road to Damascus and it blinded him for days. But I think what that story from Paul tells us is that we must come to a point in our life where we realize that it would be better to be blinded by God's goodness than unobstructed by a divine apathy. You might hear about the divine watchmaker, the sort of deist frame of belief where people say, I think God made the universe and put it in motion and stepped back. Or maybe you've heard of other kinds of gods from other kinds of religions who it's always about atoning for all the things you've done wrong. It's about self-perfection. Well, that's not at all what the God of the Bible is about. We must come to a point where we would rather be blinded by his goodness than unobstructed by his thoughtlessness. The always inspirational Helen Keller, she says this: walking with a friend in the dark is better than walking alone in the light. And when someone like Helen Keller says that, you know to listen. I wonder if you feel this. I wonder if you've had the experience of knowing that you would rather be with friends, with those that you trust in the darkest of times than in perfectly fine times, but deeply alone. And I wonder if you have the gift of knowing those aren't your only choices. The story of the gospel is about a friend, Jesus Christ, the Son of God, who came not only to walk with us in our present darkness, but always to lead us toward the light of his goodness and grace. You don't have to choose walking alone in the light or with friends in the dark. Christ is the friend who will lead you to the light. And he does this, and he's able to do this because of the cross. The great preacher A.W. Tozer wrote this. If you hear nothing else, just take this one with you. The cross is the lightning rod of grace that short circuits God's wrath to Christ so that only the light of his love remains for believers. The cross is a lightning rod. It takes all the broken parts. It takes all of the failures and all of the sin and all of the sadness, and it short circuits it to Christ, who delivers us through his sacrifice to the light of God's love. That is why Christ is our everything. So, as a final note, I just want to say that Isaiah 9 doesn't simply ask Israel to wait for the good times coming. It doesn't simply ask Israel to wait for the coming of Christ. It actually grounds its prophecy in past faithfulness on God's part. If you look at verse 4, you'll see these words, "The rod of his oppressor you have broken as on the day of Midian." That references to Judges chapter 7. It's the story of Gideon leading the Israelites to a momentous victory over the Midianites. And it's included here as an allusion or a reference to a past event because it's saying God has always been good to us. God was good, he is good, he will be good. We're not asking you to accept the prophecy of light just without any evidence. God has provided the evidence. The Midian in your life, those moments of grace, those moments of goodness, when you feel like they're not coming, can you look back and find those moments? Find the Midian in your experience. Because I believe you can. I believe you can find moments of light and goodness, even in the worst moments. I believe that when you do, you'll see that God can no more be a house for darkness than he can withhold the light from those he loves. And when you see that kind of light, again, beauty does follow. Victor Hugo, the author of Les Miserables, he said this, "To love beauty is to see light." To love beauty is to see light. And it's a particularly telling detail. If you know the story of Les Miserables, then you know that Jean Valjean, the main character, is saved by the gift of candlesticks, a place to put the light. To love beauty is to see light. And so in this season of Advent, in this season of celebrating the gift of Christ who is the light of the world, can I just encourage you to be a person and a people defined by a love of beauty, a love of the kind of light that so many in our world are still looking for, and even you, if you're honest, are probably still looking for in hard seasons and dark seasons in your life. Let us be a people unified by a pursuit and a cherishing of beauty. Let us also be committed to finding light in everything we can, which pours through the cracks in everything we are, thanks to the goodness of Christ, who is our everything. Please pray with me. Dear Heavenly Father, thank you so much for the gift of your Son, for the gift of light, for, if I can be so bold, even the gift of darkness, to give us the contrast that we need to understand just how good you are. Give us the strength and courage to ask that we be blinded by your goodness rather than perfectly fine apart from you. And may we in the season of Advent, at the closing of a difficult year, find comfort in the great, true, and everlasting light of your love for us. In your Son's name I pray.